The cowgirl who rode alone for years finally found someone worth slowing down for. She had a rope coil on her saddle horn the color of old blood, and she could throw it 40 feet with one hand, which I know because the first time I saw her, she dropped a loop clean over a fence post across my yard, and I thought, for 1/2 second, that I was about to be a very embarrassed man. She wasn't roping me. She was roping my fence post because her gelding had spooked at a snake, and she'd lost her grip on the lead rope of the pack animal she was trailing, and the pack animal had tried to bolt through my split rail, and she fixed the whole mess in about 8 seconds while I stood on my porch holding a coffee cup I'd forgotten about entirely. The mug had gone cold. I don't know how long I'd been standing there. Her name was Del Prout, not Della, not Delphine. Del, she told me that before she told me anything else, once she'd climbed down and walked over with the lead rope in one hand. She said it the way a person says something they've had to correct 1,000 times and are tired of correcting but will correct again because the alternative is worse. I said, "How do you do? I'm Cal Whitmore." She said she knew the fence and she was sorry about the post and she'd replace it before she moved on. I told her the post was fine, it was an old fence, and I asked her if she wanted water for the animals. She looked at me a second, not suspicious exactly, more like she was checking a measurement twice. She said she'd be grateful. I want to get something straight before I go much further because I've told pieces of this to a couple of men I trust and they always get the same notion about it, and the notion is wrong. This wasn't a story about a lonely old rancher and a pretty woman who appeared like rain. I was 54 years old. I'd been alone on this piece of ground for 11 years since my wife Margit passed from a cancer that moved fast once it decided to move. I was not pining. I was not waiting. The ranch, 340 acres of grass and creek, and a stand of cottonwood that shades the house in the afternoon, the ranch was enough. I'd made it enough deliberately, and I wasn't in the habit of pretending otherwise. What happened was something different. Something I didn't have a word for at first. Her horse's name was Poco, a dun gelding going a little gray at the muzzle, maybe 12 years old with good feet and a scar along his left shoulder where she said he'd gone through a fence as a 2-year-old and nearly bled out. She'd bought him for $40 off a man who figured he was finished, and she'd stitched the wound herself, and he'd been hers for 10 years since. She told me this while the gelding drank, not because I'd asked. Just the way a person with horses talks to another person with horses, laying out the relevant history like it's a deed of trust. I had 2-quarter horses myself, good-working animals, not pets. She looked them over without being asked and said the bay on the left had a left hind hoof that needed attention, a slight flare at the toe, and she wasn't wrong. I'd been meaning to get the farrier out. She wasn't saying it to embarrass me. She was just the kind of person who observed things and said them plain. We ate lunch because I'd made too much. I always made too much. A habit from when there were 2 of us, a habit I'd never quite broken, and she ate the way a person eats when they're used to eating alone and fast, no ceremony. But she thanked me and meant it, and she asked about the ranch with actual curiosity. Not polite curiosity. She wanted to know about the water rights, the grazing rotation, whether the creek ran through August or whether I had to pump. Real questions. I answered them and asked my own, and she answered those, and we talked for maybe 2 hours about nothing but the land and the animals on it. She didn't ask why I was out here alone. She didn't ask about a wife or children or what had come before. I didn't ask about her. That's a thing about people who have lived close to the ground a long time. They know which questions to leave in the ground. She was moving, she told me, from a ranch up near the Montana border where she'd spent 3 years breaking horses for a family operation. Moving where? I asked. She said south generally. Something would come up, it always had. She said this without bitterness or romance, just fact. Something would come up, it always had. She'd been doing this 22 years, she said, since she was 28. Hiring on, moving on, doing it well, moving again. The work was good and the moving was fine and she'd gotten used to it. I said it sounded like a life, not sarcastically. It did sound like a life, a real one. She looked at me a beat and said most people said it sounded lonely. I said most people worried too much about their own loneliness and not enough about whether they were doing anything worth doing. She looked at me again with that measuring look, and then she almost smiled, not quite, just the corner of her mouth, and said she might agree with that. She left around 3 o'clock. The post was fine, I told her again. She shook my hand. Her hand was harder than mine, and I work cattle for a living. She rode south down the county road, and I watched until the road curved and she was gone, and then I went back to the day. I thought about her occasionally over the next week. Not constantly. Occasionally. The way you think about a particular fence line that didn't sit right, something to return to. I'd found myself talking to her differently than I talked to most people, without the usual friction of having to explain what I meant. That was rare enough to notice. I didn't expect to see her again. 3 weeks later, I was pulling a calf that was coming wrong, hind feet first and the cow in trouble. And I heard a horse on the road and then a woman's voice saying, "Do you need a hand?" And I said yes without looking up because I needed a hand badly, and it was Dell. She was off her horse and had her jacket off and her arms in beside mine before I could say anything useful, and between the two of us we got the calf out and breathing in about 4 minutes and the cow settled. The calf was a heifer, little and dark, and she stood up wobbling while we leaned on the fence post and got our breath and looked at her. Dell said, "Good work." To me, not the calf, though honestly the calf had done most of the hard part. I said I was glad for the help. She said she'd been coming back through, and she said this matter-of-factly, as though people came back through all the time, which in my experience they didn't. Not on a ranch 3 miles off the paved road. I asked where she'd been. She said she'd taken a 2-week job near Sheridan helping move a herd. Paid well. Now she was moving on. I asked where. She paused half a second and said she wasn't entirely sure yet. I said, "There's work here if you want it. Not a full hire." But the fall gather was coming and I was short-handed, and she was plainly better on horseback than anyone I'd get from the board in town. She looked at the fence post we were both leaning on. Then she looked at the heifer who had found her mother and was nursing, her whole back end wagging. Then she looked at me. She said she'd think on it and let me know in the morning. She rode out and came back the next morning at 6 with her pack animal and a look on her face that wasn't exactly a yes but was the shape of one. She said she'd work the gather and we'd see. I said that was fair, and I showed her the bunkhouse, which was clean and had a wood stove, and she nodded at it and went to settle her horses. 6 weeks. That's how long the fall gather and all that comes with it took us that year. It shouldn't have taken 6 weeks. It was 340 acres of ground I knew better than my own hands. But we went slowly, or rather we went at the right pace, which I'd been rushing before because there was only one of me. There's a difference in the quality of a thing when you've got the right help and aren't compensating for the lack of it. She was extraordinary on a horse. I knew it when I watched her from across a draw the 3rd day, cutting a group of strays off a brushy hillside. She and Poco worked like one thing, no wasted motion, no noise, the strays turning almost before she asked. 11 years of working alone, I'd gotten used to doing everything adequate and nothing fine. Watching her, I had the strange feeling of a man who's been getting by on poor light and doesn't realize it until someone walks in and opens a window. We ate dinner together most evenings, not by arrangement, just the way things settle into pattern when 2 people are doing serious work in the same place. She cooked 2 nights and I cooked the rest, and we talked about the work and the animals and things we'd seen in other parts of the country. And she had opinions about weather and grass, and the way certain families ran their land, and her opinions were sharp and specific, and she didn't soften them for politeness. She asked me once, about 3 weeks in, what had happened to the person who used to be in the big house with me. She asked it directly, not unkindly, just directly. I told her about Margit. I told her the shape of it, the years we'd built this place together, the years we'd been good company for each other, the way she died quick once it started and how in some ways that was a mercy, and in other ways it was a second shock on top of the first. Not enough time to say certain things, though I'd learned not to dwell on what I hadn't said because it did no good. Margit had known what there was to know. I was pretty sure of that. Dell listened the way she did most things, completely. No reassuring noises, no trying to fill the space. When I was done, she said, "She sounds like she was worth keeping." I said she was. Dell said that's a lucky thing to have had someone worth keeping, even for a while. I said I'd thought the same thing eventually. Dell told me then, because I'd told her about Margit, she told me about a man she'd been close to when she was 33. She said it quietly, and it was clear she'd closed certain doors around this and wasn't going to open them all the way, and I didn't press. What I understood was that something had gone badly and she'd been alone by choice since, not by accident, and she'd made the choice stick. I asked if she'd ever regretted it. She said some mornings, not most. I nodded and we watched the fire, and then she said she'd see me at 5, and she went to the bunkhouse, and I sat there a while longer. I want to say this plainly because I think it's the important thing. and I don't want to make it sound like something other than what it was. I wasn't falling in love with her in the way people usually mean that. What I was doing was something slower than that and less dramatic. I was recognizing her. The way you recognize a tool that's made for the hand that's holding it. Every day we worked together, and she did the work the way I did the work and knew what I was thinking before I said it, and had her own thoughts about it that were different from mine and usually improved the outcome. Every day of that, I understood a little more what had been missing from the 11 years before, and it wasn't company. I'd had some company. I'd made do. It was this particular match, this exact way of being alongside someone. I wasn't certain she felt any version of the same thing. I was fairly certain she didn't know what she felt about anything that wasn't a horse or a stretch of ground, because she'd spent 22 years getting very good at not settling long enough to feel much else. The gather finished on a Thursday. Cold by then, mid-October, the cottonwoods gone yellow and beginning to drop. We moved the herd to the winter pasture and fixed 3 sections of fence, and I paid her what I owed her and a little more. Friday morning, I came out at 5:30, and her horses weren't in the corral. She'd left clean. Stalls mucked, tack hung up, the bunkhouse swept. A note on the table inside that said, "Thank you for the honest work." I stood there and read it twice, and then I folded it and put it in my shirt pocket and went and fed my horses. I'm not going to tell you I handled that well. I handled it like a man handles something he didn't know he wanted until it was already gone, which is not gracefully. I went about the day's work, and the day's work got done, and I didn't think about it more than I could help, which was about once every 20 minutes. This went on for 3 weeks. Then she came back. She came back on a Wednesday afternoon with early snow starting to spit out of a gray sky, and she rode into the yard, and I was at the fence with a post-pounder, and I set it down and waited. She climbed down, and she tied Poco, and she walked up to me, and she stood about 3 feet away and looked at me with her hat pulled low against the wind. She said she'd gotten 40 miles south and took a job at a place outside of Casey, and it was fine work. They were decent people. But she'd worked there 9 days, and the whole 9 days she'd been thinking about, and she stopped. I waited. She said, "I keep thinking about the creek. Your creek, the way it sounds in the evening." I said, "It's a good creek." She said, "I know that's a strange thing to say." I said it wasn't particularly strange. She looked at me a long time. The snow was coming down light, the kind that wouldn't stick, and there were flakes in her hair under the hat brim. She said, "Cal, I've been going 22 years, and I've never stayed anywhere I didn't plan to leave." I said I understood that. She said, "I think I'd like to try." And she said it the way a person says something that costs them real money. No drama, just the price laid out. I looked at her. I looked at the horses and the yard and the hills going gray in the early dark. I looked at her again. I said, "There's work here through spring and room enough in the house if you want it, and if you decide come February it isn't for you, no harm done, you go when you want." She said that was fair. And then she walked up and put her hand flat on my chest, just for a moment, and looked at me the way you look at something you've decided to trust. And she said, "You're a steady man, Cal Whitmore. I needed to tell you that. I don't know why it took me 40 miles to get to where I could say it." I put my hand over hers and held it there. The snow kept coming, and the horses were restless, and we had to get them in, and there was work to do before dark, and we did it. Shoulder to shoulder in the barn in the last of the light, both of us knowing what had been said without needing to say it again. That was 4 years ago. She is here now. She is in the kitchen at this moment, I can hear her, and Poco is in the second stall, and her rope. That old dark red rope, a little frayed at the Honda now, is hung on a nail by the barn door where she put it the night she came back. I used to think a man got one turn at a thing like this. One good woman who saw him true. I'd had my turn, and I didn't expect another, and I wasn't asking for one. She came back because of a creek she couldn't get out of her head. That's the truth of it. There's no better explanation. I'll take it. I've spent 4 years now being known by someone who doesn't miss much, and doesn't say more than she means, and chose this ground and chose me on it when she could have been anywhere else on a continent she'd covered a good portion of. That is not a small thing. I know what it is. I know what it costs a person like her, and knowing that, every morning when I hear her moving around in the kitchen before the light comes fully up, I feel, there's no way to put this that doesn't sound like too much. I feel like a man whose accounts have finally settled. Like the work I've done and the man I've been didn't go unwitnessed after all. She asked me once, late in that first winter, whether it bothered me that she'd left the first time. Whether I'd been angry. I told her I hadn't been angry. I'd been disappointed the way the ground is disappointed after a rain that doesn't come. Not angry at the sky, just dry. She sat with that and then she said, "I'm sorry I left." I said, "You came back." She said, "I came back." Outside the window the cottonwoods are bare now, and the frost is on the grass and Poco is visible from here, standing in the near pasture with his breath making small clouds. The creek is low this time of year. You can still hear it on a quiet morning, which most mornings are. She said I was a steady man. After 22 years of going, she said that's what brought her back, steadiness, the creek's sound and a steady man. I've been called a lot of things in my life, some of them fair, some not. That one I'll keep.